So I want to talk about the periods you're going to be choosing from in terms of what we're going to be covering in History of Latin America this spring. So the first period is the post-colonial period. What we're talking about here is after independence, so give or take, starting in the 1820s, going till about the 1920s. That's a long period. And so oftentimes this, and Chasteen, your textbook does this, breaks the post-colonial period to two separate periods, the post-colonial and the neo-colonial. But let me talk about the whole thing writ large, and then we can talk about the differences between the post-colonial and the neo-colonial. So the post-colonial is focused on the superiority of Europeans over the assorted indigenous, African, local Latin American population. So European superiority and this is, of course, according to elite leaders. As a student of mine used to say last year, white makes right. So they are Latin American elite leaders at this point believe in the cultural, economic, and ultimately racial superiority of Europeans. And they want to take Latin America and make it as European as possible. So economically, what we're seeing in this is it goes from a principally local agricultural economy overall to an export-based agricultural economy, i.e., in the beginning of the post-colonial period, people are growing things for local consumption. By the end of the post-colonial period, Latin America is sending lots of raw materials, agricultural stuff, overseas to North America and Europe. So it starts out as a local agricultural economy, and it moves towards an export agricultural economy. Great access, that's better. And export agricultural economy. That's the basics of the post-colonial period. So when I said the neo-colonial, this kind of subdivision, neo-colonial, this is a period of direct U.S. intervention in the region. And this occurs, give or take, 1880s to the 1930s. But I don't necessarily, if we want to sort of break that down a little more, we can talk about this. But generally, I'm going to say post-colonial 1820s to 1920s. Again, focused on European superiority and the movement from this small-scale agricultural economy and society after independence from Spain and Portugal to this much larger export-based, far more European-looking economy and society at the end of the period. So that's the post-colonial period. The next one that is on that list is the nationalist period. What we're talking here is 1920s to the 1950s. These dates are really kind of slidey. They're big gray areas, but good general guidelines. This is the period we're in you see an overall rejection of ideas of European superiority and an adoption of an embracing of the potential and even superiority of the local Latin American population. Superiority. And what that means is, if it's white makes right in the post-colonial period, in the nationalist period, it's a celebration of racial mixing. It's a celebration of the mixing that occurs among Amerindians, Afro-Latin Americans, even European Latin Americans, any other group of people, and a celebration of the fact that in Latin America, they're really mixing a lot. And so to be then Latin American isn't to be Afro-Latin American or isn't to be Amerindian, but rather to be Latin American is to be like all of these things. And while in the post-colonial period, racial mixing is really seen as something bad, in the nationalist period, it's something to celebrate. Racial mixing equals racial mixing equals awesome. Economically, this is where industrialization actually hits Latin America. Not all of Latin America, but lots of parts of Latin America. Industrialization. All right. There we go. Awesome. Okay, so the next period that I talk about, or that is an option, is the Cold War, which is 1950 plus or minus to 1990. What the Cold War sees is an adoption of a kind of binary worldview. Communism on one side, Western democracy on the other. And the idea that you are either one or you are the other. If you oppose capitalism, you are a communist, even if you're not necessarily saying that that capitalism is bad, but rather you're like, well, listen, we're a capitalist economy, yet mysteriously, Amerindians are still really almost always poor. The Amerindians aren't getting an equal share here of the economy. Bam, you're a communist. And this has some very legitimately violent, in fact, deadly consequences in the form of dictatorships. So, communism versus capitalism / Western democracy. And you see a rise of very violent dictatorships to quote unquote save democracy. The big player in all of this is the United States. The return of US intervention. The United States being the primary opponent of the Soviet Union. Communism, if communism had a single great defender, it was the Soviet Union. If Western capitalism and democracy had a single great defender, it was the United States. It's the USSR versus the US, red versus blue, however it is you want to put it. That's the Cold War, and this totally defines Latin American society, economy, politics, the whole shebang during this period. And then there's the last one, which I'm just going to call the contemporary period, from 1990s to present. And this one's a little more complicated because it's still happening. So what you get is, during this period, you get movement away from dictatorships. So dictatorships end. And a swing toward a more socialist direction for part of it, what we like to call a swing left. Then, as we are now beginning to see in some places, a swing right. Whether that's, for example, Bolsonaro in Brazil, a right-wing neoliberal capitalist who objects to the idea that it's the government's job to take care of all of its citizens equally. Instead, subscribing to the idea that, hey, listen, you take care of yourself, and if everybody just watches out for themselves, society ultimately will advance farther and faster. What is called neoliberal capitalism. Now, we're going to have a section, in your way there, sorry. We're going to have, at the end of this semester, several class periods to discuss some of the more pressing modern issues, such as, for example, this whole issue of immigration from Central America. But the time I'm recording this, by the time you see this, as of the recording at least, the government's still shut down over this whole question of the wall. And to understand that is going to take a few lessons, but we'll work on that after all of these. So again, what you got is post-colonial, white makes right, nationalist, celebration of the local, celebration of racial mixing, Cold War, the United States versus the Soviet Union, and some really bloody results that occur in Latin America because of that, and then the contemporary, which is the period that we're living in right now. Those are the four basics. You can look in your Chasteen if you want any more specific than that, but those are the four periods, more or less, from which you'll be able to choose these topics of the race-class connection, the role of women, and this issue of the colonial relationship.